father says video evidence prompted state police to take another look at a crash that put his son in a coma.
As Rob Masson reports, after reviewing the case in an ongoing investigation, a North Shore police officer is accused of drunk driving.
It has been 26 days since 23-year-old Seth Clare was critically injured in a head-on collision on Highway 1078 in Folsom. And this is what's left of his Ford F-250 truck.
If he would have recovered and not have a memory of this accident, he would always believe that he caused a horrible accident.
Seth Clare's father, Jost, received the initial accident report from Louisiana State Police, showing his son had been cited for crossing the center lane in a head-on collision which sent him to the hospital in a coma the night before Easter. The driver of the other truck was Franklinton police officer Leonard Holloway, who was traveling eastbound with his wife, an employee of the St. Tammany Sheriff's Office.
It was actually a citation that looked like a receipt from a cash register, that Seth was at fault.
Hours after the accident, with his son in a coma, Jost Clare began hearing about a number of empty beer cans at the scene of the crash, and he went to the site. He spoke with the owner of a nearby convenience store, the only business in the area, who seemed to know a lot about what happened.
She told me that she knows a lot of details because she has video.
That video showed a horrific head-on collision which led state police to change its initial description. Instead of Clare crossing the center line, state police now say it was Holloway whose pickup truck crossed into the path of Clare's.
Once I saw the video, I knew that maybe the conclusion that was made in the original police report wasn't complete, wasn't correct.
Clare says he notified state police, who would eventually change the crash diagram in a follow-up report 2 weeks later. Initially, it showed that Clare's westbound vehicle in gray crossed the center line. The follow-up diagram showed that it was Holloway's eastbound truck in blue that moved into the path of Clare's westbound truck.
Do you have any idea why the initial report showed that Holloway did not cross into the oncoming lane?
Well, generally speaking, on any type of serious crash or crash of this magnitude, when you're talking critical condition, or even say even worse with fatalities, you're going to see multiple levels of scrutiny on a crash investigation. So you're going to have a ton of eyes looking at it because it's a lot of data.
9 days after the accident, state police carried out a search warrant which led to Officer Holloway's medical records being uncovered, showing Holloway had a blood alcohol level of 0.094%, over the legal limit. The initial report said nothing about evidence of alcohol at the scene, but the follow-up report referred to driver 1 Holloway as having slurred speech and appeared to be disoriented. The subsequent report also referenced glass and aluminum cans scattered around the vehicle, including a Miller Lite box and a glass wine bottle. The follow-up report also referenced a sour smell in Holloway's truck and 2 tumbler cups on the floorboard.
Stopping by that store and talking to the owner of the store, I didn't have any expectations that I would walk away from that with a complete different view.
A source close to the investigation tells Fox 8 that the trooper involved in the initial investigation has been reassigned and an internal affairs investigation has begun.
I can't speak to what the initial thoughts of the trooper were on the scene that night. I can just tell you through our investigation process, the facts that I told you just a minute ago are where we're at.
Are you relieved that the subsequent report found the other party in the wrong and your son was in the right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because, everybody makes mistakes, but nobody wants to be blamed and have to live with the guilt of causing an accident like this.
And after being in a coma for 2 weeks, Seth Clare is now breathing on his own and is in rehab at Truro. Former Officer Holloway's termination was approved last week by the Franklinton Town Council. He faces a number of charges, including DUI and vehicular negligent injury, and is out on bond. We reached out to him for comment, but have not been successful. Meg?